We are living in a truly golden age of chess, with unprecedented interest in the game, never-ending drama, much of which is related to our species' obsolescence in the battle for ultimate chess domination, which is now decided exclusively among computer programs that anyone can access on their phone. And then there's Magnus Carlsen, who has taken to literally rolling a 20-sided die to determine what opening move he will play. Yes, my friends, this is what it's come to, whether it's from sheer boredom or an attempt to create interesting content for his live stream, or both. Magnus has been leaving the first move of his online games in the hands of God, or fate, or random chance. Whatever you think is most responsible, we can all be grateful because in his only encounter with the world's #2 player Hikaru Nakamura in this most recent Title Tuesday, Magnus rolled the unlucky number 13, indicating that he should begin the game with White's second worst possible move, coming in right behind g4, which is f3. This is known as the Barnes opening, and it's quite abysmal. It does nothing for White's piece development and actually hinders it, depriving the g1 knight of its most natural f3 square. It also opens the diagonal to the White king for no good reason at all, which is why e5 is Black's strongest response, making possible a future queen check from h4 while taking control in the center. But Hikaru decides not to respond with an objectively strong move, or even a mediocre one. Being a content creator himself, he knows that the buzz created by his move f6 is probably going to be more valuable than the slight boost in his chances of winning the $1,000 Title Tuesday prize that would result from him playing a stronger move. And this is already an extremely rare position, seen in only about 1 in 120,000 online games. So needless to say, this variation does not have a name, but to Barnes opening enthusiasts around the world, it will undoubtedly become forever known as the greatest thing to ever happen variation. Magnus plays a good move now, e4. Hikaru responds e5, after which White's strongest options include moves like bishop to c4, knight to c3, and d4. But Magnus decides to transpose into a sort of king's gambit now with the move f4, whose only difference from the standard king's gambit is that Black has this pawn on f6 instead of on f7. And this actually benefits White, since here he doesn't have to worry about Black playing queen to h4 check after capturing the pawn on f4, which Hikaru doesn't do. He opts for the much stronger and engine-approved d5, following the general principle that says when your opponent is goofing off on the wing, strike in the center. Magnus captures on d5, and after queen takes d5, he does get to play knight to c3 with tempo on the queen, but after queen to e6, Black has a very decent position. Both of his bishops now have diagonals unobstructed by pawns. He's got the strong pawn on e5. His queen is defending against bishop to c4, which would target his weakened diagonal. So the engine is saying that this is more or less equal. Magnus responds with a good move, f takes e5, after which the inexperienced player might be tempted to recapture with the queen. But this puts the queen on a more vulnerable square where White will be able to attack it with a tempo-gaining developing move. One option is bishop to e2 followed by knight to f3, though the engine likes knight g to e2 a bit better, planning d4, supporting a potential bishop to f4. Hikaru plays the better move in the game, which is f takes e5. Now this does give him an isolated pawn, but it's nothing that can't be dealt with. Play continues knight to f3 and knight to f6. Hikaru knows that it's best to get some piece development in before he thinks about pushing his pawn to e4. And here we have a nice move from Magnus, bishop to b5 check, which accomplishes a couple of things. First, it puts him only one move away from castling, which he'd like to do before Hikaru has the chance to play bishop to c5, preventing it. He's also provoking the move c6, now played by Hikaru, so that after bishop to a4, he's ready to hop on Black's most sensitive light square diagonal next with bishop to b3, attacking the queen. Additionally, Black can no longer develop his b8 knight to its best square, c6. Hikaru decides it's now time to push his pawn to e4, a very committal decision. This kind of intrusion into enemy territory with the isolated pawn can either be very disruptive, or it can just weaken your position and leave your pawn more vulnerable to capture. It's not always easy to tell which is the case, but Hikaru's decision to push the pawn now is fully supported by the engine, showing just how good his instincts are. Magnus responds bishop to b3, attacking the queen. It goes to f5. He now answers the threat of pawn takes knight on f3 with queen to e2, a good move. pinning the attacking pawn to the king. Hikaru plays bishop to e7, unpinning the pawn, and so once again threatening to win the knight on f3. Magnus has a couple of good options now. He could move his knight towards the center with knight to d4, but probably avoided this since after queen to e5 attacking the knight again, white doesn't have a great way to defend. Queen to e3 or queen to f2 would just invite bishop to c5, hitting the knight again while pinning it to the queen. Queen to c4 looks kind of promising, supporting a possible knight to e6, but the engine says that white is just firing blanks here and is giving bishop to g4 with a big advantage to black. So go figure. It's really incredible how these two players are able to disregard these dubious variations so quickly, even when they look fairly reasonable. Turns out that the best move white has here is just to put his knight back on f3, exploiting the pin on the e-pawn, allowing black to repeat the position with queen to f5. So this is probably why, in the game, Magnus decides to play knight to h4 instead. This move caused Hikaru to go into a 90-second think, which in Blitz is an eternity. In his post-game analysis, he said that the reason he took so long was that he thought that this move knight to h4 looked like a mistake, and so he was trying to find a way to punish it. He said he was considering the move queen to h5, threatening both queen takes knight and bishop to g4, which would be quite nasty, but he rejected this line since after queen takes h5 check and knight takes h5, white can just ignore the attack on his knight by the bishop now and simply castle. Since if bishop takes h4, he's got bishop to f7 check, picking up the knight on h5. So what Hikaru plays in the game, after knight to h4, is queen to g4, both attacking the knight and threatening queen takes e2, which would not be very good for white, no matter how he recaptures. So Magnus's move, queen takes g4, is best. Hikaru recaptures with the knight, threatening bishop takes knight on h4. Magnus can only defend with g3. He's not worried about Hikaru damaging his pawn structure with bishop takes h4, since giving up the bishop pair in a position like this that is starting to open up would not really be worth it for black. Better is something like knight to f6, defending the wayward pawn on e4, which is currently under attack. Hikaru's in no mood for such passivity, however, opting instead for a brazen pawn sacrifice with the move e3, which is actually a mistake, though not obviously so, since taking the pawn is not white's best response. This would just leave him with a weak isolated pawn of his own, blocking his dark squared bishop's diagonal. Black could then post his knight on e5 without it being kicked away with the move d4. So best for white here is to just castle, taking the lead in development, and if black takes on d2, then he's just helped white jump even further ahead in development by activating his dark squared bishop. Magnus goes with the second best option in this position though, which is to push his d-pawn. However, he pushes it to the wrong square, d3. Better is to play d4 to keep black's knight out of e5, and then just go after the pawn on e3 with knight to g2 next. Magnus has a different plan though. After rook to f8 from Hikaru, he plays h3, giving a kick to black's knight, which is the sole defender of the pawn on e3. This significantly weakens his kingside though, and after knight to f2 attacking his rook and rook to h2, now his h-pawn is attacked twice and only defended once. It could be that Magnus was expecting knight takes h3 next, to which he could respond bishop takes e3 and all would be well, but Hikaru has a much more problematic move up his sleeve with bishop to d6, threatening bishop takes g3, which needless to say would be quite bad for white, threatening basically everything he cares about here on the king side. That would be an absolute disaster. Magnus knows it, and so plays knight to e2, defending g3. Now it's worth noting that in this inferior line that Magnus has chosen with this move h3, his move d3 is actually preferable to pushing the pawn to d4, as it's depriving black's knight of the e4 square. Hikaru now captures on h3 with his bishop, a good move, but only because after bishop takes e3, attacking his knight, he's got knight to g4, counterattacking the bishop on e3. If not for this move, he'd be losing. So after rook takes bishop on h3, Hikaru grabs the bishop on e3, now threatening rook to f1 check, picking up the a1 rook. White's best defense is to play rook to h1, covering that square. Then he can play king to d2 and bring his other rook into the game, but Magnus makes a significant error now with king to d2. This allows Hikaru's knight to come into f1 with check, which pretty much forces the white king to move backwards. Going to c3 would be much too dangerous when black can already begin to construct a mating net with knight to a6, threatening bishop to b4 check, and if that's addressed, then there's knight to c7, threatening to come into b5. That would not end well for Team White. So Magnus puts his king back on e1. Best for black now is to leave his knight on f1, the engine suggesting g5 followed by knight to d7, which would leave white tied up, unable to play king to d2 to activate his rook on a1. Meanwhile, his other rook and his knight are tied down to defending his pawn on g3, which is attacked twice. So that's how black can maintain a big advantage, but Hikaru now puts his knight back on e3, giving Magnus the chance to play rook to h1, preventing knight to f1, thereby equalizing the position. Hikaru continues knight to d7, we have king to d2 attacking the knight on e3, which Hikaru moves to g4, setting the stage for a series of decisions by Magnus that could accurately be described as a rapidly accelerating downward spiral to destruction. It all begins with his decision to play knight to d4, opening a file to black's uncastled king while eyeing some pretty succulent squares. Looks nice, but it's premature. Better would have been to move a rook to f1 or to e1, because now Hikaru has rook to f2 check, to which there is no great reply. You don't really want to move the knight back to e2, where it would be pinned to the king. If king to c3, then there's bishop to e5, pinning the knight that way, threatening c5. Sadly, there's no time to challenge black's invasive rook with king to e1 followed by rook to f1, since black can just castle and get his rook to e8 with check first. So Magnus moves his king to c1. I guess he feels that's the safest square. Hikaru continues sensibly, just castling. Magnus puts a knight on f5, attacking the bishop, attacking a pawn. Bishop to e5 defends both. Next is knight to e7 check, and king to b8. Hikaru, of course, avoids king to c7 in view of knight to e6, which would fork his king and rook. White's best chance at this point is probably to sacrifice on c6, with knight takes c6, b takes c6, and knight takes c6, grabbing 2 pawns for the knight with a fork of black's king and rook. Magnus didn't play this, since after king to c7, knight takes d8, and king takes d8, although white's slightly up in material for the moment, his position is absolutely miserable, with no easy way to get his a1 rook into the game, while his other rook is tied down to defending against rook to f1 check. Black's got the 2-on-1 kingside pawn majority, threatening to make it a 2-on-0 with bishop takes g3. So it's really a matter of preference, I guess. How do you want to lose as white? Magnus, in the game, chooses knight to e6, rejecting positional misery in favor of tactical annihilation. Gotta respect it, at least he's gonna go out with a bang. So the rook on d8 is now hit, Hikaru moves it to e8, attacking the knight on e7, which sadly has nowhere to go, being trapped. Magnus counterattacks the e5 bishop with d4, it captures the pawn on g3, nothing has been solved, the knight is still trapped. Now there is another chance to grab a rook for the 2 knights with knight to f5, rook takes f5, and knight takes g7, forking the rooks. But after rook to f8, white is totally losing for pretty much the same reasons as in the previous variation we looked at. Magnus decides to try rook takes h7 now, which drops a whole rook to rook to f1 check, king to d2, and rook takes a1, but at least now he has rook takes g7, defending that knight on e7, while eyeing a couple of loose pieces of Hikaru's. But now Magnus is a whole rook down, for which he only has 1 extra pawn. So Hikaru knows he just needs to play it safe, consolidate the position, and he's home free. He begins by addressing his loose pieces with bishop to e1 check, and after king to e2, puts his knight on f6. Magnus is finally able to extract his knight from e7 with knight to f5. We have bishop to b4 from Hikaru, threatening rook to e1 check, which would win some material on e6. Magnus gives a kick to the bishop now with c3, but Hikaru doesn't retreat. He wants to trade pieces, and so plays knight to f8, attacking the pinned knight on e6 with the second piece. Magnus responds rook to f7, hitting the knight on f6, but after knight takes e6, Magnus decides he's seen quite enough, and so resigns the game. Seeing that Hikaru is threatening various nasty discovered checks, if bishop takes e6, then the rook recaptures with check, defending the knight on f6, when black ends up 2 pieces up. He could try moving his king, but there's not really a safe square, and any way you slice it, black is going to emerge at the very least a whole piece up, probably more. So what a fitting end to a fascinating struggle based on a frivolous opening gamble by the great Magnus Carlsen, demonstrating why you should never put your faith in blind chance unless you're really bored and or want to have some fun. In that case, at least do your very best to avoid going on a blundering spree in the middle game, especially when you're up against Hikaru Nakamura. But that's all for now. Take care of yourselves and each other. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this content. Hit that like button. Leave a comment if there's anything you want to get off your chest. And I will see you next time.